June 12, 1944. A small, waterlogged clearing near Carentan, Normandy. The air hung heavy and thick, saturated with the metallic scent of cordite and the rotting decay of the Bocage countryside. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, commander of a seasoned company from the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, pressed his body low into the muddy floor of his makeshift command post, a shell-cratered cellar beneath a crumbling farmhouse. For 6 days, they had been subjected to a grinding, relentless pressure from the American advance, a slow, brutal retreat characterized by close-quarters skirmishes and the constant, deafening hammer of enemy artillery. Richter wiped a smear of mud and sweat from his eye, the grit stinging his skin. A young Obergefreiter named Dieter huddled next to him, his eyes wide and vacant, occasionally flinching as the heavy rounds landed. "The Americans, their artillery, Herr Hauptmann," Dieter stammered, his voice barely a whisper over the distant thump-thump of incoming fire. "It never stops. It's not like the Eastern Front. It's faster." Richter simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the map illuminated by a flickering oil lamp. He knew the difference. On the Russian front, German artillery often held a terrifying precision, delivered by powerful 15-centimeter Nebelwerfers or the classic 8.8-centimeter flak guns firing horizontally. But the Americans had brought something else entirely to this battle, a sheer, mind-numbing volume of fire. Just then, a new, sharper sound pierced the drone of battle. Not the long, whistling moan of the heaviest naval guns, but a series of quick, sharp cracks followed almost instantly by a terrifying, high-pitched shriek. "Incoming! Get down!" Richter roared, shoving Dieter further into the shadow of the stone wall. Before the cry was finished, the first salvo struck. Crump! 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 The ground beneath them bucked violently. Dust, stone, and clods of earth rained down into the cellar opening. The force was staggering, not just concussive, but utterly destructive. Outside, the world seemed to be tearing itself apart. The Jaeger position, which had been holding a crucial road junction barely 200 meters away, was instantly enveloped in a curtain of gray-black smoke and fire. Richter knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was not the work of their usual 75mm pieces. This was heavier, and the rounds were impacting with an unnerving, almost rhythmic speed. The barrage continued, a rapid-fire sequence that sounded like a colossal, metal-rending machine gun. The rounds, stamped with the mark of the U.S. Army's standard M2A1 105mm howitzer, were exploding with a terrifying efficiency. Each shell unleashed 2 Ballard 18 hard Textchachi crawlers of Composition B high explosive, but it was the sustained pace of the shelling that was truly breaking the men. A well-trained American crew could get a full 6 rounds away per minute, concentrating the destructive power of a dozen lighter guns into a single, overwhelming minute of fire. Richter pulled out his field binoculars, lifting them cautiously above the broken cellar opening. Through the smoke, he could see the remnants of the forward trenches. They were no longer trenches, but a pulverized, churned-up wasteland. A shattered half-track, previously used as a firing post, was now little more than a pile of flaming, twisted scrap metal. The defenders, the very best of the Wehrmacht's airborne troops, were either buried, stunned, or simply gone. This was the opening move of a larger American push, and it was being executed with an artillery power that the German command had severely underestimated. The noise faded to an ominous, ringing silence, leaving only the cries of the wounded and the crackle of burning wood. Richter lowered the binoculars, his face grim. The Americans were coming, and their artillery had just blasted the door wide open. "Get the remaining men back to the secondary line," Richter ordered, his voice raw but firm. "Move quickly. Tell Feldwebel Schultz we need immediate counter-battery fire, or we will all be overrun." He paused, listening to the echoing silence, the realization of the new threat settling deep in his bones. This was going to be a long, bloody summer. June 12, 1944, 3 kilometers west of the German defensive line, near Sainte-Mère-Église, Private First Class Ray Tex Jenkins, a gunner on a M2A1 105mm howitzer for the U.S. 29th Infantry Division, spat dirt from his mouth and grinned, a wide, dust-caked expression of grim satisfaction. His crew, tucked neatly behind a low hedgerow, had just completed their third mission of the morning. The barrel of their howitzer, a distinctive, sturdy piece of engineering, was already hot to the touch. 3 missions, 60 rounds, the section chief, Sergeant Miller, called out, checking his watch. Under 20 minutes, total firing time. That's good work, boys. That's a lot of hurt delivered. The M2A1 wasn't the biggest gun in the American arsenal, but it was arguably the most vital. It was the backbone of the divisional artillery, prized for its lethal combination of mobility, reliability, and sheer rate of fire. While German artillery doctrine often favored careful spotting and precise heavy-hitting salvos, the Americans had perfected a different philosophy: fire for effect, delivered with speed. Their fire control centers, using newly developed techniques and better radio communications, could call in a time-on-target (TOT) barrage from multiple batteries simultaneously, hitting a German position with a destructive flash flood of explosives. Tex glanced at the breech. The 105mm high explosive rounds they were firing were devastatingly effective. They used a sophisticated system of bagged propellant charges, ranging from Charge 1, the smallest, to Charge 7, the maximum velocity, allowing the gun crews to adjust range and trajectory in seconds. This flexibility meant the M2A1 could lob a shell high over the bocage hedges to smash a concealed trench, or fire directly at a fortification barely a kilometer away. "Load Charge 5, fuse delay on impact," Sergeant Miller shouted, reading the new coordinates barked over the field phone. The crew sprang into action. Tex and the assistant gunner maneuvered the 42-pound round into the gun. The loader quickly inserted the correct propellant bags, and the breech snapped shut with a reassuring clank. "Ready, Sergeant." Miller sighted the deflection and elevation, making the final, minute adjustments. "Fire!" Tex pulled the lanyard. The gun recoiled with a violent, controlled jump, and a thunderous crack split the air. This speed was what was shattering the German infantry. The howitzer's simplified but rugged design allowed trained crews to maintain an astonishing burst rate of 8 rounds per minute for short periods, far outstripping the standard sustained fire rate of most comparable German field pieces. When 5 batteries, 20 guns, opened up on a single grid square, it wasn't just shelling, it was the absolute physical obliteration of a position. In the German lines, the infantry often didn't have time to seek cover between salvos. The next round was already on its way. This psychological impact was as damaging as the physical shrapnel. A captured German lieutenant, interrogated later that week, would admit that the American artillery felt like a storm that could not be weathered, only endured until death. For Tex and his crew, this was simply their job. They were delivering, reliably and rapidly, the sheer industrial firepower of America. And as the gun reset, waiting for the next mission, Tex already had the next high-explosive round resting on his knee, ready to load and deliver another piece of the Normandy nightmare to the men of the Wehrmacht. June 13, 1944. An observation post on a small rise overlooking the Wehr River Valley. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, now separated from the remnants of his company, moved with a reconnaissance patrol along the shell-pocked track. Their mission was grim: locate the source of the devastating barrage and report its position to the divisional command for targeted counter-battery fire. Richter carried a pair of heavy Zeiss field glasses, constantly sweeping the landscape. German doctrine dictated that artillery positions should be fixed, heavily camouflaged, and protected by elaborate earthworks. Locating them should have been relatively simple. Look for the telltale flashes, the churned earth, and the trails leading back to the guns. "There, Herr Hauptmann, over there," whispered Gefreiter Schmidt, pointing toward a copse of oaks about 1,500 meters distant. "I saw a brief muzzle flash just moments ago, right at the tree line." Richter trained his glasses. He focused on the area, noting the perfect cover afforded by the dense foliage. Minutes crawled by. He waited for another flash. the predictable sign of the battery resetting for the next fire mission. Silence. Then, a column of dust rising swiftly away from the cops, heading deeper into the American-held territory. "What is that?" Richter muttered, lowering his glasses in confusion. Schmidt, a former transport driver, squinted. "It looks like a few trucks, maybe, towing something low." What they were observing was the next critical advantage of the American M2A1, which often became the M101 in later service: its exceptional mobility. Unlike many of the Wehrmacht's heavier guns, the 105 mm was relatively light, weighing around 2,260 Hortext Kilo-Tollers, about $5,000 Hortext LBs, in travel configuration. It was designed to be towed quickly by the ubiquitous Dodge 6 trucks, or M3 half-tracks. In the heat of battle, this mobility allowed American batteries to practice shoot-and-scoot tactics. After firing a massed salvo, often lasting only 60 to 90 seconds, the gun crews would hook up the trails, quickly move a few hundred meters, and set up in a new, pre-surveyed firing position. This rapid displacement rendered the slow and careful German counter-battery calculations almost useless. The American guns simply weren't where the German observers expected them to be. A German battery might fire a perfectly aimed counter-salvo into a position 5 minutes after the Americans fired, only to find they were shelling empty air and freshly turned earth. "They move their entire battery immediately after firing," Richter stated, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "They do not stay to be targeted. They hit us, and then they vanish." This was a profound psychological blow. German infantry were used to artillery being a fixed, measurable threat. This American method, leveraging the reliable firepower of the 105 mm and the industrial efficiency of their motor transport, turned the artillery from a siege weapon into a rapidly deployable, hit-and-run mobile fortress. It amplified the feeling of being constantly and randomly targeted, robbing the Lancer of any sense of safety or predictability. Richter felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Reporting this tactic to his superiors would only confirm the awful truth. The Americans were fighting a war of industrial, mobile firepower that they simply could not match, and every time the dreaded, high-pitched shriek of an incoming 105 mm round sounded, his men would know that even if they survived the blast, the guns that fired it were already miles away, reloading for the next inevitable strike. June 14, 1944. A muddy, desolate crossroads known only as Point 187, northwest of St. Lo. The attack had begun just before dawn, not with the sharp crack of machine guns, but with the roar of the American division artillery, concentrating all its might on the thin line held by elements of the 352nd Infantry Division. Lieutenant Ernst Vogel, a platoon leader, found himself pinned in a shallow, hastily dug foxhole. His ears were ringing, a painful, high-pitched squeal that threatened to drown out the continuous rhythmic crashing of the 105 mm shells. The impact was less a shock wave and more a sustained physical blow that compressed the air in his lungs and shook his teeth loose. He watched, horrified, as a direct hit struck the two-man position 30 meters to his left. The earth there simply erupted. There was no recognizable shape left, only a wider, smoking crater of red clay and pulverized timber. The explosion, generating massive overpressure and fragment velocity, turned the soil itself into a deadly cloud of secondary shrapnel. Vogel's training screamed at him, "Artillery must be endured. Wait for the pause. Then move." But the pause never came. The M2A1 batteries, operating with textbook efficiency and overwhelming supply lines, were delivering a sustained, deliberate fire. The doctrine was simple. If a target was worth shooting, it was worth saturating. For the German infantry, this meant minutes that stretched into an eternity of being buried, uncovered, and then buried again. The specific effect of the 105 mm shell was critical. While not as large as the 105 mm long Tom, its standard text 1 high-explosive HE projectile produced a dense, highly effective fragmentation pattern. The Americans used proximity fuses where possible, setting the shells to explode just above the ground, maximizing the spread of shrapnel and devastating infantry caught even in shallow trenches. Vogel grabbed the arm of the Funkmesserträger, radio operator beside him, whose face was ghostly pale beneath the grime. "Try to raise anyone. Tell them we need smoke, anything. We cannot hold this cratered earth." The true genius of the American deployment lay in its concentration of force. The 105 millimeters was so numerous, so reliably supplied, and so rapidly employed that the barrages were not localized incidents, but continuous broad front attacks. For a German soldier like Vogel, the shelling was impersonal, inexorable, and overwhelming. The physical damage, the craters, the shredded trees, the dead, was terrible enough. But the lasting effect was psychological. The sheer sound, the rapid repeating thump, shriek, crump, created a state of perpetual fear. Soldiers began to suffer from acute shell shock, known as Kriegsneurose by the Germans, far more quickly than their commanders had anticipated. Men would simply freeze, unable to move or obey orders, paralyzed by the knowledge that the next high-speed projectile was already arcing silently toward them. When the shelling finally lifted, signaling the imminent push of the American infantry, Vogel found that half his platoon was gone, buried or killed, and the other half were stunned, trembling wrecks. He looked out over the pulverized crossroad. The ground was no longer a defensive position. It was a cemetery carved out by the industrial might of American artillery. The infantry advance would now be less a fight and more a gruesome process of clearing the rubble. June 15, 1944. Divisional Headquarters, Wehrmacht, 7th Army, near St. Lo. General Major Philip Miller stared at the reports piled high on his table. The air in the bunker was cold and smelled faintly of damp concrete and burning paper. The reports coming from the front were uniform and deeply troubling. They were not focused on the effectiveness of American armor or the daring of their infantry, but on the relentless, crippling power of the U.S. divisional artillery, specifically the 105 millimeter howitzer. "General, the men are reporting a concentration of fire we have simply never encountered," Oberstleutnant Franz Kessler, the operations officer, explained, pointing to a hastily drawn chart detailing ammunition expenditure. "Their rate of fire is astonishing. Our reconnaissance flights confirm their gun positions are moving constantly. Shoot and scoot, exactly as Hauptmann Richter reported." Kessler gestured to a technical drawing of the American weapon. "The M2A1 is simple, reliable, and their logistics can feed it endlessly. Each American infantry division has 3 battalions of these guns. That is 54 howitzers per division, not including corps and army support. Our standard artillery regiment has significantly fewer guns of comparable power, and our supply chain is breaking under air superiority." The tactical reality was stark. The 105 millimeter was transforming the engagement from a battle of maneuver into a grinding process of destruction. The German advantage had always rested on superior tactics, excellent anti-tank weapons like the POC-40, and the quality of their veteran infantry. But the American artillery neutralized all three. Trenches were flattened before the infantry arrived. Counterattacks were broken up miles behind the lines before they could even form. Even the formidable $8. "8" text, Bakim, dollars flak, when deployed against the American artillery, was too few and too slow to counter the sheer volume of 105 millimeter shells pouring down range. The most damning section of the report dealt with morale. The German soldiers were not just being killed, they were being systematically shattered by a force they could neither see nor stop. The official Wehrmacht term for the American artillery method became known informally as Feuerwalze, fire roller, a rolling, unstoppable tide of high explosive. "The effect is not purely destructive, General," Kessler concluded quietly. "It is demoralizing. Our men are facing a machine that simply does not stop. They are stunned by the sheer industrial efficiency. We can shoot down their planes, but we cannot stop their factories from building these guns and these shells." Mueller ran a weary hand over his face. He looked at the map, seeing the steady, inevitable blue advance where their once firm green line had been. The American 100 mm M2A1 was not merely a gun, it was the embodiment of the vast material superiority of the United States entering the European war. The German strategy had depended on bleeding the invasion dry on the beaches. Instead, they were being ground into the Norman earth by a weapon whose rapid-fire capability and unmatched mobility had ensured a constant, overwhelming pressure on every single German position. "We must find a way to silence them," Muller said, though the words tasted like ash. "If we cannot, Normandy will not be a defense. It will be a slow, agonizing defeat."